All right. Wonderful. So welcome, everyone. My name is Katrina Kano. I'm a PhD researcher at KU Leuven in Belgium. Welcome to the next webinar in our series Carbon Pricing Conversations. In this monthly webinar, we facilitate dynamic conversations with researchers from around the world on all things carbon pricing. These webinars are organized by the ERC-funded research group PolyCarbon, which is led by Professor Katja Binkoff and consists of five PhD students studying the trends for the expansion and contraction of carbon pricing policies. Today's conversation will be with Rafael Postpischil, who pursues a PhD on the policy processes of environmental taxation at Free University of Berlin. Rafael will discuss his working paper on an evolutionary policy process, an ethnographic study of introducing the German carbon price. And we're joined as a discuss will be Professor Miranda Schreurs, who will be joining us with both academic and practical expertise. So to begin the conversation, Rafael will present his draft, then we'll have the Professor Schreurs respond with some discussion points. And you're welcome to discuss any work that, like practical or academic, that you have to share. And then if you'd like to ask a question, we'll have the Q&A after Rafael responds to the discussion points, where we can open up for a conversation on this paper and all things carbon pricing. So if you'd like, Rafael, you can go ahead and begin. You have about 15 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes left.
So, yeah, hello everyone. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me well, first of all, because I had some interruptions with Katrina?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, just let me know. So, yeah, I'm Rafael Postpischil from the Freie Universität Berlin. And the draft paper I'm presenting today is the first case of 3 that I'm studying in my PhD. I decided to study policy processes of economic instruments of environmental policy after I gathered a couple of years of experience in environmental policy consulting. And yeah, you can see my title as with all clumsy academic paper titles, I try to incorporate all aspects of my research in the title already. So we can see here it's about policy processes. I'm particularly interested in studying real-world policy processes in depth and the people involved there. I employ evolutionary policy theory, a rather new theoretical approach. In terms of methods, I chose ethnographic modes of inquiry, namely participant observation and semi-structured interviews. And my case is the introduction of the German carbon price in 2019, which was an unexpected and sudden case of policy change. Next slide, please. So the literature on why carbon prices are introduced is quite comprehensive, as you can see here, and you all know, can be roughly structured around the key groups of explanatory factors, which are highlighted here, which are ideas, rational actor perspective, groups and networks, institutions, and external factors. Ideas-based approaches highlight information, international norms, communication, or public framing as decisive for why carbon prices are introduced. Individual actor perspectives center the self-interest of policymakers. For example, unprecedented instruments are said to be difficult to implement. Also, the specific costs, but on the other hand, the few benefits of climate policy are put forward in this regard. Groups and network approaches are especially prominent in the literature. Strong opposition by special interests of regulated producers or consumer groups is termed regulatory capture, a core reason for the hesitant use of carbon pricing. Institutions are the 4th group of explanatory factors. That means formal and informal political rules such as democratization, climate goals, good governance, legal configurations, all highlighted as influential. And finally, external factors such as socio-political or economic configurations, as well as external focus events, are carved out to be relevant. Here, public opinion, economic development, election results, fossil fuel consumption, energy prices are all shown to be important. So even though the literature is well advanced, individual policymakers their micropolitics of ideas, motives, and interactions in the policy process of carbon pricing is rather understudied, I'd say, and that's where I try to make a contribution. So next slide, please. Yeah, since my research question is why-centered, I need a theoretical approach that synthesizes all the 5 groups of explanatory factors. A few well-established theories come to mind, such as multiple streams or punctuated equilibrium or the policy feedback framework. However, the causal mechanism of how these 5 factors are in continuous interaction, this causal mechanism is not so pronounced, I'd argue. The question is what really drives the policy process. And evolutionary policy theory provides a rather parsimonious account of how these factors play together and provides a rather clear causal mechanism. As I tried to illustrate in the graph, we have ideas who couple with the interests of individual actors, forming so-called memes that strive to persist and spread in an environment of network structures, institutions, and external factors. All these 5 factors are in continuous interaction, while the self-interest of individuals drives the process and ideas provide solutions and meaning to these actors. The evolutionary causal mechanism of variation, selection, and retention constantly decides over which memes persist or not, and over what is finally to become the policy output. The system of the policy process understood as evolutionary also highlights the self-organizing feature, the lack of central agency at the system level of governance, looking at change from within, as Paul Carney put it in 2013. Evolutionary policy theory is rather unprecedented. There's just one empirical application, as far as I know. Still, I wanted to put it to an empirical test. Next slide, please. It's puzzling that carbon pricing is debated in expert cycles for decades now, and in principle, many policymakers, environmentalists, and business actors alike favor the approach. Still, the application is limited worldwide in terms of scope and ambition. Germany is one of the European countries with a very low environmental tax income share. However, even though this was considered very unlikely in 2018 by most political actors and observers, in September 2019, Germany decided to introduce a national carbon price for transport and heating. Therefore, I decided to investigate this puzzling case of sudden policy change in a key global economy and international climate policy actor. In terms of methods, there has been increasing attention to ethnographic modes of inquiry in political science in recent years to study the workings of policy processes in detail while still contextualized in a real-world surrounding. So this seemed suitable for my research endeavor, and I conducted participant observation in the German Federal Ministry of the Environment. I did so for 2 months in September and October 2019, around the time the government decision was taken. And I immersed in the work of one of the departments there, which was key to the carbon price. But I was also in contact with other departments of the ministry and with other relevant ministries. My involvement, just to give you an idea, my involvement included writing submissions and draft speeches, as well as interacting with other relevant units. I participated in internal and external meetings and events, and I confidentially evaluated internal documents. Due to previous activities as a scientific policy advisor for the ministry, I was already accustomed to the surroundings, and it can be so-called an insider ethnography, what I did. Beyond the in-depth participant observation I conducted semi-structured interviews with policymakers from the Federal Environmental, Economic and Finance Ministry, parliamentarians from governing parties, scientific government advisors, environmental and economic interest groups, a key labor union, and a specialized journalist. So this allowed me to capture the context of the policy process in which my participant observation is located. And I coded my comprehensive field notes and the transcripts with qualitative analysis software and drew conclusions based on both frequency as well as persuasiveness of the arguments. The information gathered was triangulated between informants and interviewees, as well as findings from relevant primary and secondary sources. So next slide, please. Yeah, so what did I find? Key actors from three backgrounds were especially decisive for putting the idea of carbon pricing on top of the political agenda in Germany in 2018 and 2019. Firstly, leading actors in the environmental ministry, especially environmental minister at that time, Svenja Schulze, and State Secretary Jochen Flassbart. They engaged in a lot of convincing work also within their own Social Democratic Party. Secondly, climate progressives in the conservative government fraction. Here, MP Andreas Jung and a few other climate progressives stand out and helped overcoming the initial strong opposition to any form of carbon pricing by conservatives. And thirdly, central scientific government advisors were decisive. An enormous amount of government advice accompanied the whole policy process, but Professor Ottmar Edenhofer, who is director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, amongst other positions, and Professor Christoph Schmidt, who is chairman of the Council of Economic Experts in Germany. These two definitely stood out. Their combination of a strongly climate concerned economist, Professor Edenhofer, and a rather neoclassical conservative economist. This combination was influential all across the democratic political spectrum. Especially Professor Edenhofer's policy advice was reported and also experienced as fruitful interpersonally by a broad range of actors involved. Rather, in the final stage of the policy process, then Professor Andreas Löschel imported the idea of a national fixed price ETS from an Australian research exchange as a compromise between the carbon tax demands of the Social Democrats and the emission trading demands of conservatives. Conservatives had made an, in their eyes, truly market-based system a condition for their support. The effort for carbon pricing by these actors was strongly reinforced by favorable surrounding factors. So the most influential interest group was arguably the German Umbrella Industry Association, who had positioned in favor of carbon pricing in 2018. This was a major factor for the conservative fraction and party. Regarding institutions, the presumably missed climate targets for 2020 and related EU effort-sharing payments were decisive as they helped convince political actors such as Chancellor Angela Merkel and the then Finance Minister Olaf Scholz. Surprisingly, leading politicians only became aware of the potential sanctions in double-digit billions until 2030 if the targets would have been missed. They only became aware at that time, beginning 2019, even though the commitments had been made years before. And as indirect but still highly relevant external factors, the climate protests and the heartfelt climate impacts around that time were decisive. Irrespectively of their background, all interviewees highlighted Fridays for Future as influential, even though some of the conservative MPs I spoke to were quite critical of the movement. The last crucial indirect factor were the increasingly heartfelt climate impacts in Germany in 2018 and 2019. We had heat, drought, crop losses, and forest dieback, which drew public and politicians' attention to the problem of climate change. And climate change became tangible also for politicians themselves, not just in view of their electorate. Eventually, all these factors played together, and a national carbon price as a preliminary fixed price ETS with several compensatory measures was the policy output. This can be understood as an evolutionary process of variation, selection, and finally retention of proposed policy options. At the micro level, this entailed diverse intentional policy preferences, which then at the final macro level turned into a bricolage-like non-intentional policy output as the result of the emergent quality of the policy system. To close with a citation, one staff member of an MP explains, "I think that's what's interesting about politics. These processes that come all at once and that can then develop very quickly into such positions. And then it just goes from the Bundestag to all the districts and is represented. And that's how an issue moves forward." From the investigation, I feel that evolutionary policy perspective helps understand the self-organizing and selection mechanisms of the policy process. This seems to me a valuable addition instead of overestimating the agency of individual policymakers designing on a drawing board. Next slide, please. So for this round here of carbon pricing enthusiasts, I try to distill some takeaways for carbon pricing policymaking, even though one case study is naturally case-specific. It seems very helpful if many policymakers regard existing policy approaches as insufficient, are in search of something new. It's promising to find the frames that fit the policy premises of the hesitant politicians, such as truly market-based for German conservatives, scientific government advisors who are respected all across the political spectrum help a lot. So this means form alliances, be persistent, be kind and authentic. That's how several key actors from diverse background perceived, especially Professor Edenhofer's advice. It takes policymakers willing to take certain risks, such as unresolved legal challenges, which still exist in the German carbon price. The multi-level commitments and related financial pressures were also very decisive, so this can be helpful, definitely. Climate protests and heartfelt impacts also help, as well as one has to say the absence of other major crises. Many policymakers explained that with Corona and inflation, carbon pricing would probably not have been implemented. Point in case is the abandoned price increase in Germany for next year that we just got here. Not on the list, but obviously it's good if influential interest groups come out in favor. However, that one is especially hard to influence. So next and final slide, please. Regarding the development of evolutionary policy theory, I can propose the specification that power is the essential feature of the selection mechanism. It determines to what degree individuals, groups, institutional or external factors can foster or hinder to a certain degree the moving forward of the policy idea. Thereby, different sources of power exist, such as ideological, economic, or political power, which all played into the different explanatory factors laid out. A second specification of John's theory is that ideas and individual actors do not couple at random, but dependent on which sources of information, advice, and peer pressure the actor is exposed to, and to what extent the idea fits the core beliefs of the individual. Future research could study further the micropolitics in and between organizations that produce such convergence of policy proposals. In my participant observation, I was able to be part of finding and feeling the Hausposition. That means how ministries' position is carved out and how officials have to eventually defend a policy design output that they did not support initially. In terms of theory advancement, specifying power in the evolutionary policy theory theoretically and empirically provides a promising route for future research. Also, further conceptualizing time and space-bound contingencies of selection mechanisms, which are probably not universal, could help for a more generalized understanding of evolutionary policy. Finally, can we draw conclusions for policy making overall? Just like evolutionary theory in biology, the predictive power of evolutionary policy theory is limited. Still, an evolutionary understanding can help actual policy making by advocating governance experimentation and iterative trial and error policy learning. Providing space for governance experimentation increases the chance of successful policy solutions to occur. Policies also that become more stringent over time help to strike an adequate balance between predictability on the one hand and regulatory flexibility on the other hand to cope with unintended effects of implementation. The analyzed case illustrates that existing policy can alter very suddenly. Within a limited room for maneuver, evolutionary policy theory highlights how policy processes are driven by humans and ideas, not just abstract organizations or external forces. And this ability to policy change seems essential in light of pressing ecological and social challenges. So yeah, this is me trying to end on an optimistic note. I want to thank you all for listening, your questions and feedbacks. And yeah, the literature is on the following slides. And just to bring that up once more, a paper is unpublished, so please do not circle.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen now. And Professor Schreurs, would you like to comment? And then I think I already see a hand raised. We can take that, yes, after the discussion points from you.
Very much. I'll go ahead and be American and call you Rafael, if that's okay. Yeah, so first of all, congratulations. A very interesting case study and one where you have really done a terrific job of pointing out the intricacies of a policy process and how policy change was brought forward. And you're also doing what we look for in dissertations in terms of focusing attention on a particular theoretical perspective and trying to move that theoretical perspective forward. But I'm going to play the role of the devil's advocate and exactly, and raise some questions which I think could be useful for you to think about. So I think you've done a very nice job of showing us the changes over time in thinking about carbon taxes, and the link up with the emissions trading system, as well as the role of particular individuals like Edenhofer or Lasche, or thinking about how particular groups, the industrial groups, had special interests that they were pursuing here. And I think you also have an important point by saying power matters, power influences debates. But it's also here that I wonder a little bit how your argumentation really differs from a couple of other schools that have looked at questions of policy change. So one would be what I'll broadly call the John Kingdon school. Of multiple streams and the importance of policy entrepreneurs, and that those policy entrepreneurs play the role of coupling ideas that are floating around in these different streams, and finding the right moment of time, the window of opportunity to produce or push a policy forward. So I hear some of that in how you are presenting your work, and yet you're calling it evolutionary theory. A second area where I think it might be interesting to have some discussion are discussions that say a lot of the policy change literature is missing an important dynamic, and that is technology. That just like there are developments in the policy world, there are developments in the technological world. And you could also perhaps say there are developments in non-technological areas that impact upon technologies. And without these developments, for example, without the developments of institutions around emission trading, this discussion wouldn't be happening. And so here I would ask, is this something that could be missing from your model? That actually we need to take a look at how emission trading systems evolved in other areas, for example, with lead or with ozone depletion, chlorofluorocarbons, and how that made this whole discussion a possibility, that it wouldn't have been a possibility otherwise. Then a third question would be a question related to power and the power of narratives. So I think what you're talking about here with ideas, in a sense, are narratives as well. But why do we think about certain issues the way we do? And why was this economics modeling, this economics perspective so important? To what extent is that also something that has to do with institutional development and who populates certain kinds of institutions? So I remember discussions in the past that looked at environmental regulatory development and said something that was really important to understand the shift in moving from command and control to more market-based mechanisms had a lot to do with who was hired by different institutions. And that in the past, it used to be more lawyers, and then it later became more economists. And maybe today, the economists are on the way out, and other groups are coming in because we see that the economists got a lot of things wrong, too. So I'd just be kind of curious. In a way, I think that fits a little bit into your ideas of evolution, but I didn't hear you really talk about them that way. And then a final question is, what's the difference in your work between your efforts to understand a process of the past, how policies changed and developed, with the prescriptive dimension of your argumentation, where you are saying, here are ways that policymakers could improve what they're doing? How can you actually see that out of a process that's evolutionary? So evolution, the question is evolution a chance factor? You know, does it happen by chance, or does evolution happen because of certain paths and structures? So maybe that can get the discussion started here, and you can choose to answer these questions or not, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. So those were, great insights. Rafael, if you would like to comment, and then we can open up to the wider discussion.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for taking the time to look at the paper and give me this feedback. It's very, very good to hear. And I'm also constantly playing my own devil's advocate with this theoretical approach. And I mean, I didn't come up with this evolutionary policy theory. I have to say, it's Peter John from Great Britain. And it heavily borrows from Kingdon's multiple streams approach. And basically, the two things that attract me beyond what Kingdon, or there's a lot of scholarly work going on multiple streams still. Yeah, if you look at Helvig from University in Heidelberg, I was also in contact with her when I started my PhD, because in the beginning I was thinking doing more of Kingdon-inspired work. But what attracts me more is that it seems a little bit less clumsy, the theoretical lens. The story is a little bit easier to tell than with Kingdon. The vocabulary is even more difficult in Kingdon's world. And the second thing is that I find it, I mean, yeah, there is a lot of debate on whether there's actually something like a causal mechanism in the social world. We can debate this forever, and I love all the epistemological questions that this raises. But still, I find it interesting that John proposes this idea of, okay, we have an evolutionary mechanism of selection, of variation, selection and retention, and this might work in other aspects, but by the natural world. And this also links to your last question, where you ask, yeah, I'm drawn between the chairs. What can we learn from past processes? Every process is individual and it's case specific and it's time specific. Still, I try to derive some policy advice. The question you asked, whether it's chance or it's patterns, I think it's both. Evolutionary policy makes a strong case for chance and for randomness and for non-intentionality at the policy overall level, at the macro level. Still, what this causal mechanism proposes is that how far these ideas and individual actors make it in the policy process depends on the selection mechanisms that are imposed upon them by external factors, by interest groups, and by institutions. So yeah, on the one hand, it's random. On the other hand, it depends on this configuration of institutions and the other things. I will keep that in mind and try to work something out. Yeah, I don't know whether it should be me talking all the time. There's a lot of things I would like to think about more. What you said about technological development. From the case I studied, I didn't see any particular technological or even institutional development. Everything we knew about renewable energy, everything we knew about how emission trading systems can be designed, we knew that 5 years before as well. Like in Germany, it might be the case that we came to a tipping point where those economists were so much like annoying those command and control people in the policy area. Like I talked to a lot of them, and we have some classical actors who were always against market-based instruments. Jochen Flassbart is someone like that. Olaf Scholz was also, he never really got the idea, why should we do this market-based? It would just help rich people buy themselves out of the, and for some reason in 2018, 2019, something tipped. Those people, for some reason, became convinced that we now need carbon pricing. We can no longer have just funding policies against a crooked price system. Yeah, but I will keep that in mind and think more about it. Yeah, and what you said about lead and ozone depletion, that's the right term. Yeah, I would say the same. We had these things 3 years before, or 5 or 10 years before, and for some reason it was unthinkable to have a national carbon price in Germany. When I started studying this, I began 2017, 2018, I never would have thought that I would, in my research, follow the introduction of a German carbon price. And half a year later, I was like, oh my God, I have to get into the ministry, something's happening, I really need to be there and figure out why. Yeah, so, but yeah, I'll keep that in mind. Power of narratives also. I'll think more about that. Thanks a lot.
There's a hand. Let's see. Jasmine, would you like to add a comment?
Yeah, hello everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for your presentation. There's a few of us in the room here from Utrecht University, and we found it really interesting. I had some specific questions, actually a good segue from your comment just now about your ethnographic approach. So I was wondering, firstly, I guess, was that timing of you getting into the ministry partially chance, partially the networks that you already had? Was it fortuitous? Did you predict something like this would happen for your research, and how did you go about getting yourself in that situation? I guess related to that, I was wondering about your comment that you were an insider ethnographer. So you'd worked in this area before. How did you work on sort of being really aware of your own positionality as a participant in that environment? And then finally, I'm keen to know if you have time left in your studies, or if maybe a postdoc would follow up on this case or maybe other cases using the same sort of ethnographic study. Maybe not as fortuitously, but yeah, are you looking at maybe if you could repeat how the policy is being implemented and what people think about it now? Thanks.
Yeah, maybe it's easier if I answer directly, or should we collect, or what?
No, go for it. You can answer directly. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the people's interest in the room. I can just see you, Jasmine, but yeah, thanks for listening. How did I mean, there's a lot, I'm talking a lot about chance in my evolutionary policy theory. It's the same with my ethnographic approach of, I mean, in the beginning, I was not so convinced that it's a good idea to study ongoing policy processes because you never know what you're going to get. And for some reason, I'm quite lucky because also relating to your last question, I'm doing 2 more cases. And I also did participant observation in another organization. This is being recorded now. I have to consider what I'm like. Also, an interest organization, an interest organization in the agriculture sector, and also looking at an economic instrument of environmental policy. So I'm trying to collect insights from different organizations that are central to the policymaking process in Germany. And then in my PhD, which is going to be a book, try to include 3 participant observations in different organizations, so have an overarching perspective to a certain degree. Yeah, how to get in there? Really annoy people is helpful. I'm constantly writing emails and calling people, but it also, of course, helps that I worked for the in research projects for the environmental ministry. But the department I ended up in, I was never really working for this department especially. So yeah, it probably helps that I knew the surroundings a bit and also had people I could talk to or have me reference. But yeah, so and how to reflect my own position. I mean, that's that's the basic job of ethnographers. Like half of their papers is reflecting their own position. I'll do more of that in the book later, but basically what I draw from the literature is, you have to somehow try to make the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar familiar. So that's what I tried to do in the notes I took, also talking to other people in my research group and trying to tell them about weird details of how a ministry functions, and reflecting outside of how much I know the workings of a ministry. But being there in a department made me also feel I didn't know too much before, because policy advisor work is something different than really working in the ministry. So I have to reflect whether it's a true insider ethnography, but yeah, probably. And in terms of follow-up cases, exactly. I also did the second participant observation, and there will hopefully be one more. Let's see what Corona does to these plans, but yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. There's a comment, I believe, in the chat. It says you did mention that there were climate events that had occurred in 2018 and 19, but you didn't make reference to news and information. Do you think the 2 things, the events and the news/information about the events, are one and the same?
Of course, I wouldn't be a social scientist if I would say they're the same. But I mean, there was broad news coverage, and I also have that in the paper, that it was something that was broadly debated in society and in the news. But what I found more interesting is that I tried to find out whether for the people who make policies, whether especially for politicians like MPs, whether they're just looking at their electorate in a vote or office-seeking way, or whether they experience climate change themselves. And from the talks I had and the situations I was in, I would definitely say no. It also played a role how they, as individual humans, experience climate change and how they maybe are forest owners and see the forest die back. If you think of conservatives, so yeah, I would say it was the climate impacts that occurred, and not just how it was reported on the climate impacts that occurred. Because the job of MPs is to get in touch with people. They read the news a lot, but they also like experience firsthand how these things turn out. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Absolutely. I have one comment that speaks to that. I wonder how all of these factors are operationalized. You know, like how you can measure the extent to which they do or don't happen. So for instance, in your presentation, you were talking about variation, selection, and retention as part of the evolutionary policy process or policy theory. And I don't know this approach myself, which I'm going to look into it now. Sounds very interesting. But I wonder if those aspects of it have been operationalized, and if you could use your data to show when certain things are happening, if that makes sense, like based on theoretical expectations from evolutionary biology, for instance.
Yeah, that's something I'm also struggling with a bit, because I was trained in statistical methods a lot in my bachelor, and that's where I started. And now I'm a hardcore qualitative researcher, and it's I mean, I would say I can make a strong argument that we had different policy options being proposed, and then we had this selection mechanisms of all the organizations involved who said, okay, this is okay, we support this, no way for that, or we need a new solution for social impacts because we didn't consider them as much. So then new ideas come up and are again selected. So yeah, it's a metaphor that works well from what I found empirically. But in the end, here the epistemological questions come up again. Do we discover knowledge or do we produce knowledge? You know, in the end, I produce knowledge because I impose this theoretical thinking on a real world process, and other people could just show up and say, okay, this narrative of how it happens is more plausible. So yeah, from what I was used to in the beginning of my research in my bachelor's, where I had variables and then I took data from whatever OECD countries, and then I said, okay, I'll operationalize this by that, and yeah, so it's a bit more metaphorical now, and I struggle with that, but yeah, I think it's an added value.
But you use some type of quantitative text analysis, or no? Or,
and I made transcripts of the interviews, and I did all the field notes of the time I spent in the ministry, where I wrote down what I saw, what I thought about it, what I felt about it, what I reflected on, and then I used Max QDA to code all these endless pages of text, and build categories of explanatory factors and subfactors, and that's how I made the analysis, but no quantitative text analysis like Wordfish or anything like that. No.
Cool. I just perhaps. Oh no, please, Professor Schreurs, please.
Rafael, I'm wondering if you could also say a few words about what your thinking is in relationship to the fact that there's always a lot of ideas out there floating around. And You're suggesting that some of these ideas possibly title sort of power become, they become stronger, they get preference. And then there's this concept of institutionalization and path dependencies, where it could be that for relatively long periods of time, particular ideas dominate. And that also goes back to the work of Baumgartner and Jones, where you have, institutionalization of ideas, and then it takes quite some time, and suddenly you can have a critical juncture. And when I'm listening to what you're saying, you could almost put your story into that discussion, right? That you've been doing things for a long time. The idea about carbon tax has been around for a while, but there's been a path dependency. And then all of a sudden, different things come together, window of opportunity opens, and you have a critical juncture. Why is that not enough?
Yeah, I mean, again, John developed his theory with the argument that especially multiple streams and especially punctuated equilibrium, both of them have this evolutionary approach somewhere in them in a subtle way. And he makes the argument, okay, let's be more precise. Let's not just use evolutionary as a metaphor for something that rather either takes a long time or changes very quickly. Let's be more precise on what actually happens if we talk about evolution. And what actually happens is this selection mechanism of variation, selection, and retention. And so evolutionary policy theory is not saying we don't need multiple streams anymore, we don't need punctuated equilibrium anymore. It's just another way of structuring the key factors and of highlighting the causal mechanism. So what you're saying, path dependency and critical juncture, I could definitely go and come up with a story that fits this argument as well. But what is the if we think we can have causal mechanisms in social science, that's a different debate. But what is the causal mechanism of path dependency? Path dependency itself has no causal explanation. And what I would say is that this variation, selection, and retention, sorry, I'm bringing it up over and over again until it feels more true. That actually tells us what is happening with path dependency and what is happening with critical junctures. And that's why I find it more attractive.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Just pushing you again.
Yeah,
the explanation.
It's good. Yeah, it's good.
Are there any more comments or questions from anyone? Or Rafael, are there any particular points, since this is a working draft, that you are having conflict with or issues with for the paper that, you'd like to share or get some feedback on?
Yeah, a tricky one is, like, now I brought it up in the conclusion and the outlook part of how I propose to respecify evolutionary policy theory. And for every good political scientist, it's just nice to say power has something to do with this. And yeah, I would like to enlarge on this, but for now I feel the paper is really packed already. And if I make it a tough theoretical paper on top, so yeah, now I feel a little dissatisfied with just bringing it up in the conclusion. I think power has something to do with this, and other people should think more about what power has to do with this. Yeah, I would like to, if somebody could tell me, like, how do you deal with these never-ending follow-up questions and where to make a cut with one paper and shift it to another? Yeah, how do you deal with that? And do you feel that this needs to be enlarged on in this paper? Or yeah, that would be interesting. Somebody asked if I could share the slides. Yeah, of course. And it will be, I think the whole thing is going to be recorded, so you can go back to my rambling.
I think one thing you might think about is whether or not the power question can be integrated more into your explanation, rather than telling policymakers they need to think more about it. Because your paper is actually a paper that is trying to explain an observation, policy change, and you're saying power matters. So the critique then would otherwise be, why don't you deal with it more yourself? I actually wanted to ask you one other question, and that is about the very rapidly changing climate policy world right now, and energy policy world right now. You've got the challenge that you're working on something that is being dated very quickly because of the very rapid changes due to the Ukraine war. And that doesn't mean that your paper isn't important as it is, but I'm wondering if there are ways for you to bring some of that discussion into your paper to make it as up to date as possible. If you're thinking about, the conclusion, that might actually be the conclusion that you need to add, rather than I advise policymakers to think about power, and to instead say, this paper was all about trying to understand policy change, and now we're in a period of intensified policy change around energy issues. And this means that a whole new set of policy instruments are being introduced into the discussion. And that's something that you mentioned and say you know about it. And that's the next paper that needs to be written.
I will definitely think about that. That's a great advice. Yeah, I mean, it has turned out to be a historic already, but yeah.
It happens all the time in our world.
Yeah. Especially if you dive deep into one specific process and try to account for all the details that made it happen, then it outdates very quickly. Yeah, I'll try to. But I would want to go beyond just saying, okay, now we have the Ukraine war, and then just 3 nice sentences which sound catchy, and then that's it. Yeah, I would have to consider what this really tells us. Yeah. Okay.
You could, for instance, see if the implementation of the carbon pricing policy changes after the Ukraine war, like a follow-up study that you could kind of put a hook in for later. That's one potential way to address that context.
Yeah, that also relates to what Jasmine asked, right? She asked whether I would do follow-up research on the same policy. So far, my concept of my PhD was having different policy processes and comparing between different sectors. Yeah, but that's also a very good idea. And it already does, no? As I said, we just stopped the price increase that was scheduled for 2023.
We have another hand raised by Anne.
Yeah, just in addition to the points that were brought up, and more of a comment to the debate, not particularly to your paper. Thank you very much for the great presentation, though. I'm very curious to follow your work in the future more. And just that I had an interview yesterday with someone from the EP who talked about the reformulation of the energy taxonomy during the Fit for 55 now over summer. And this has completely been cancelled because of the war, because of course you cannot tax on energy anymore. And this like opportunity of political opportunity, window of political opportunity has just closed with the war. So yeah, so as being someone who is conducting interviews on these matters through this year, I can definitely relate with changing topics over time during the year with other political changes as well.
That could be an interesting study in of itself, right? That you were collecting data on the same topic, and how does the environmental factors or the energy situation impact the way that people talk about it? Narrative analysis or something, who knows? You could still use the data even though the context changed.
That is a very interesting idea, actually.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left. Are there any other comments or questions or any final points that either the discussant or the presenter would like to share before we close out?
Maybe a question about what you're thinking in terms of publication and how you wanted to target that.
As in the end, I'm writing a book, so I'm not so dependent on the single paper publication. Still, I would like to publish this as a single case study with the theoretical arguments made in there. Since I want to have it in a scientific and also political debate earlier than 5 years later, just 3 years later. So yeah, we are also in the context of this PolyCarbon group. We are working on a special issue proposal, and I'm happy to be part of that and hope that it might work out in this context. Do you have any journals in your head that basically have been waiting for exactly this paper?
Well, there's a variety of journals out there. Energy Policy, I'm sure you know of. Journal of Environment and Development is another one. Global Environmental Politics is an important journal in the field. And then you can also always look at publications that are more focused on Germany and Europe. So whether that's German Political Science Journal or Journal of European Politics. Those will also be possibilities. Some of the journals tend to be more quantitative oriented. So in energy policy tends a little bit more towards quantitative, although not exclusively. The others are a little bit more open to the kind of qualitative work you're doing.
I was lucky to have some interview work released in energy policy a couple of years ago. So we made it there as qualitative researchers. But yeah, I see your point, definitely.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this this really interesting conversation. I think that the topic was great, and the presentation. Good luck with your work, Rafael, and thank you, Professor Schreurs, for joining us today and sharing your insights and expertise. I'll probably go ahead and stop the recording now, but we will meet again for another carbon pricing conversation next month with the PolyCarbon team. So thanks so much, and everyone enjoy the rest.
Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for listening and feedback, and especially to you, Miranda Schreurs. As a former student of yours, I'm happy to see you in this context now.
Very nice, and congratulations, and looking forward to seeing the next stage of the work.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.